Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. I mentioned in my November Marginalia video that I had spent some time in November reading the Qur'an, a new translation, a new to me translation by Tarif Khalidi, and that I really, found this was an accessible translation for me. It allowed me to sort of get into the text in a way that a prior translation I'd had access to by N.J. Dawud had not. And then I sort of just left it there and said, let me know if you want further thoughts. And a couple of people sent messages, Jordan commented. So I wanted to put together just a few thoughts around specifically like a specific translation choice that I think really helped the Khalidi translation, and then how I approached the text and read across the entire Quran in a couple of weeks. So the major translation choice is that Tarif Khalidi chooses to render certain passages and even sometimes full suras in sort of a poetic form in English. And that's very distinct from not only the Dawud translation, but many others that are just strictly prose. And that's because there are, surahs or sections of surahs where there is sort of an Arabic poetic form in the original. And he felt that that was really important. And I did find that it helped. Sometimes there are, many of the end surahs are poetic, and many of those are the earlier surahs as well. However, there are times where you'll find one that starts in sort of a poetic form and then is in prose, and sometimes there'll be multiple sections of each across the surah. And so I just really felt that was a primary reason that the Khalidi translation worked for me in this reading. It'll definitely be the version I go back to. The one sort of component this text did not, this edition by Penguin Classics did not have, was there's not necessarily like an index, and there's a very small glossary, so there's really no footnotes, and then there's a small glossary at the end for a number of sort of Arabic cities or names of prophets, or just a couple of other like Arabic letters and things like that that were Khalidi felt were important. But that's almost the only piece this edition is missing. It's otherwise quite good. Now, how did I read it? Well, Khalidi admits it's an oversimplification, but sort of says, look, if you want to get a rough chronological sense of like which ones are earliest and which in being recited and which ones are later, start at the end and work your way forward. And that is an oversimplification. But the reason he says that is because the first surah is sort of an encomium for the full text, and then after that, from 2 to what I believe is 114, they're roughly arranged in descending order of length. So the earliest, 2 through 4, 2 through 6 are quite long, 20, 25, 30 pages long. And then you get to the end, and some of the surahs, there'll be 3 on one page because there are 6 to 10 lines of poetry. And so that's quite a bit different. Knowing that, I didn't just start from the end and work forward, but that would work. I found some references and really tried to approach like which surahs were sort of the earliest ones. So clots of blood, the pen, and then just working through those. And I would read 5 to 10 a day, just kind of depending on how much time I had. And and I just found that worked. I found that worked really, really well because there are. This is a very unified text. So this is a very, very unified text. That might, somebody who's never approached it might find it unusual to find a spiritual text that is this unified, particularly in comparison to the Hebrew Bible or the, Christian Old and New Testaments, where the composition spans many years and, many different writers and many different cultures. And so there are like wildly and many different genres as well, so there are very distinct and divergent sort of texts within those books, whereas with this there is a great deal of unity within the text, but reading it in that sort of rough chronological order of composition, it's possible to note certain changes that are occurring within that time period, and just little things like so many of the earliest surahs use a first-person plural for God, a we, whereas later on it becomes a third-person singular, a he. And so there are those types of changes. As I mentioned, many of the early ones, the earlier chronological ones, have a more poetic form, whereas many of the later ones are longer and have it's almost exclusively prose. And so there's just some stylistic differences in there that I think are easier to appreciate, reading it in that order, at least in my reading. And so, I found the translation excellent. I found sort of that reading order really worked for me. And I don't know. I've never actually read it from, both times I've read it, I've chosen to read in that order, not from, page one forward, and for that choice. I do want to read just a couple so you can get sort of a sense of what it sounds like, what the translation sounds like. Recite in the name of your Lord, He created man from a blood clot. Recite, your Lord is most bountiful. He taught with the pen. He taught man what he knew not. And yet man grows intemperate, for he thinks himself exempt. But to your Lord is the journey's end. And that's likely like the first parts of the earliest surah. What's interesting is, and this edition doesn't like have it in the text, but some of the surahs will have what are like what's called a Mecca section and a Medina section, where there would be a portion that had been recited very early on in Mecca, and then later on in Medina, when it would be recited, it was not just those first 10 lines or so, but then there would be an addition, that surah would expand. And so that's also, kind of an interesting, even though it's not critically noted in here, it's sometimes possible to note the pericopes that exist and to see and sort of intuit those changes. I don't want to say changes, those expansions and amplifications within given surahs. A really interesting one. So that's sort of the first, and the second one seems to follow up with the beginning of this one. You who are muffled in your garments, up and awake in the night, all but a little, the half of it, or diminish it a little, or add to it, and chant the Qur'an in a plain speech. We shall charge you with a weighty speech. And the vigil of night is heavier in burden, yet better suited for recitation. And you can sort of sense from that there's not a huge amount of context to what's going on. Distinct from, again, what we find in many other texts where, if just to consider the Hebrew Bible, you have the first 5 books in which there's a great deal of context. It's primarily, the first, all of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus is primarily like a large context for then the laws that are given. The prophetic writings later on in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament have a context through the histories in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so there's a great deal of context behind all of those prophetic texts. And that's not the case in the Quran. So there's a great deal of intertextuality with I would say much more with the Hebrew Bible than with the Christian New Testament. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, and Jonah all pop up in the Quran as as prophets. Jesus pops up, but the intertextuality there are subtle shifts. So I think someone who has read either the full Hebrew Bible or portions of it is going to have a strong grounding and sort of context for what is in the Quran around those. So I think that's an interesting piece, and maybe is why some people don't necessarily approach this. It can be very difficult if there's not a foundation, for the reader, or if you don't have an edition that has like lots of notes to sort of fill in those blanks. I do want to add one though that's kind of a really interesting one that points to other readers who might appreciate this. So this is from the Dawn, Surah 89. By the dawn in 10 nights, by the even and the odd, by the night as it advances, does this oath suffice for a man of reason? Have you not seen what your Lord did to Ad, Irem of the columns? Its like was never created in any land. And what of Thamud, who carved out the rocks in the valley, and Pharaoh, he of the pegs? All had grown insolent and multiplied corruption on earth. So your Lord cast down upon them a lashing torment. Your Lord lies ever in wait. And so there's references to Pharaoh, but now you have Ad and Thamud, and those those cities and what happened to them. This idea of sort of, if you're familiar with Jonah, the idea that Jonah went to Nineveh and prophesied there and preached there, and there was a turning there, and so the city wasn't destroyed at that time. And that is contrasted to, Thamud, Lot from Genesis is in here as a prophet, which is interesting if you've read Genesis. I think that that perception of Lot is very different. So you have like these cities that, and these references that come across again and again and again across many different suras, and that sort of helps unify the text in a unique way. So yeah, I really enjoyed this translation. I highly recommend it if you've never approached the Quran, and that's sort of the way in which I approached it. And so part of the reason I had read it was there were a number of books I wanted to read in the next year that I felt a rereading would help with. Now, I'm not going to reread the Tales of the Thousand and One Nights, but a number of these have just a huge deal of intertextuality, of course, with the Quran. Others are more like the Book of Dede Korkut, which, though this is sort of a Turkish epic, it is pre-Islamic. And so some of the tales from the Thousand and One Night are folk tales that even predate, the 7th century of the Common Era. But one text I'm really excited to get into again next year is Attar's Conference of the Birds. Another that I'll probably be getting into this month is the Dictionary of the Khazars by Milorad Pavić, and there's a whole section of this that is like massively intertextual with Islamic faith. My Name is Read by Orhan Pamuk. And then possibly I'm considering taking a crack at Naguib Mahfouz's Cairo Trilogy in 2021. So I'm really, interested in all of those. As I've been reading Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann across 2020, I found that the surah that is titled Joseph, there are passages from that Mann incorporates into his text in a really natural and fluid way. And, I've tried not to make this a video about like reading the Quran as literature. I'm always curious about that idea, in part because, and most frequently it's people, at least here in the United States, it's people talking about reading the Bible as literature, or the Hebrew Bible as literature, and even when they don't, practice or believe in that faith. And yet there are so few, I think, who do that, who will also then go and, say, I need to go read the Quran as literature. And I don't know why that is. But I do think that approach could work. It's not primarily why. I was looking at it more as a foundation for other literature texts. But I think that approach could work. And I think specifically if people who are really into certain poets who cast themselves as prophets might find the Quran, and specifically the Khalidi translation, as an accessible text. So folks who really are maybe into William Blake might enjoy this and find it as a piece of literature to be something that they're really interested in. So again, this was just sort of a ramble on some of my thoughts, and I'd be happy to hear comments. Maybe you found a better translation that I should be looking at, and I'd be more than happy to do that sometime in the future. So let me know, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks.